She stood in her wedding dress in front of 40 guests, looked her father in the eye, and said the one sentence he never saw coming. This is the story of how she got there. And why, 3 years earlier, none of it seemed possible at all. There's a kind of love that doesn't ask permission. It doesn't announce itself with a proposal or a ring. It starts small, in a stable, over a sick horse, in a sentence that took less than 5 seconds to say. And by the time anyone noticed it had taken root, it was already too late to pull it out. This is that kind of story. Not the kind where love arrives with fireworks. The kind where it arrives quietly, survives a drought, a rival's lies, and another man's wedding ring, and still refuses, 3 years later, to leave. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Reeves had worked the Whitfield Ranch for 2 years by the spring of 1887, and in that time he'd earned a reputation he hadn't asked for and didn't talk about. The man Thomas Whitfield trusted with anything that mattered. He knew which mare would kick if you came at her from the wrong side. He knew which fence posts would need replacing before the frost even started thinking about coming. He'd turned down 2 better-paying offers from neighboring ranches because Thomas Whitfield had given him a chance when nobody else in the county would hire a man with no family name behind him. He wasn't the only hand on the Whitfield Ranch, though he was the best of them, and everyone who worked there knew it, including Silas Grady, who'd been there a year longer than Daniel and had expected the foreman's job to be his by now. Silas was a competent enough hand, but he measured his own worth by comparing it to other men's, and next to Daniel, he always came up short in his own accounting. It was a small resentment at first. It wouldn't stay small. Silas had his reasons, even if they didn't excuse much. He'd come to the Whitfield Ranch 2 years before Daniel, at 19, with a mother back in Laramie who wrote him letters asking when he'd have enough saved to bring her out west. And every year that passed without a foreman's wage was a year he had to write back with an excuse instead of an answer. He didn't hate Daniel, not exactly. He hated watching another man get, without seeming to try, the one thing Silas had spent 5 years trying to earn. That kind of resentment doesn't need much of a spark. It just needs time, and Silas had plenty of that. Daniel hadn't come to Wyoming Territory with much of a story worth telling. His mother had died of fever when he was 16, back in Missouri, and his father had never been part of the picture worth mentioning at all. He'd worked his way west on other men's ranches for 6 years before Thomas Whitfield gave him steady work, and in all that time, he'd learned to keep his plans small and his expectations smaller. A roof, steady pay, a horse that trusted him. He wasn't a man who let himself want things he had no path toward getting, and for 6 years, that had kept him from being disappointed by much of anything. What Daniel had never planned on, what he would have told you if you'd asked him in the spring of 1887, was simply not going to happen, was falling in love with the boss's daughter. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday in June. Eleanor Whitfield came out to the stable in a plain gray dress with her sleeves rolled up, carrying a bucket of oats she had no business carrying herself, and said the mare in the 3rd stall hadn't eaten in 2 days and her father was in Cheyenne, and could Daniel take a look? He could. He did. And while he worked, she stayed, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and didn't pretend otherwise. She asked him questions about the horses that weren't small talk. She listened to the answers like they mattered. When he finally straightened up and told her the mare would be fine by morning, she said, "I believe you," in a voice that made it sound like a much bigger statement than it was. He thought about that sentence for longer than he'd admit to anyone. Then he thought about it again the next week, when she came back, and the week after that. By August, she was bringing a second cup of coffee out to the stable most mornings, and neither of them called it what it was. By October, they'd stopped pretending, at least to each other, that the visits were about the horses. They talked about her mother, who'd died when Eleanor was 12, and about Daniel's father, who'd left before Daniel was old enough to remember his face. They talked about the kind of life either of them might have wanted, if the rules of Wyoming Territory in 1887 allowed a rancher's daughter to want a ranch hand. The closest they came to admitting it out loud that year was at the Founders' Day social in the town hall that September, an event ranch owners and hired hands both attended, though rarely on equal footing. Eleanor spent most of the evening seated with the other ranching families, trading pleasantries with men her father approved of, while Daniel stood near the back with the other hands, doing the same thing He always did at these gatherings, which was mostly nothing at all. Then the fiddler struck up a reel, and half the room got up to dance, and in the crush and noise of it, nobody quite noticed when Eleanor crossed the floor and asked Daniel, plainly, whether he danced. He didn't, not really, but he wasn't going to say no to her, and for 4 minutes, in a room full of 80 people who mostly weren't looking, they had something that felt, for once, like it belonged to just the two of them. When the song ended, she thanked him for the dance the way she'd thank any hand for a favor, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, and neither of them said another word about it that night. But they both carried it home. By the fall of 1887, they weren't meeting by accident anymore, and both of them knew it. Silas noticed before anyone else did, because he was looking for a reason to notice. He started finding excuses to be near the stable on Tuesday mornings. He started mentioning, to anyone who'd listen in the bunkhouse, that Daniel Reeves seemed awfully comfortable around Miss Whitfield for a hired hand. He didn't take it to Thomas Whitfield directly. Not yet. That would have looked like spite, and even Silas knew it. Instead, he waited, and he watched, and in December of 1888, when the opportunity came, he made sure it landed exactly where he wanted it to. The opportunity was money. Thomas Whitfield's ranch, like half the ranches in the territory, ran on credit through the Cheyenne banking house owned by Walter Ashford, and 1888 had been a hard year. A dry summer had thinned the herds. A note had come due in November that Thomas couldn't cover outright. He'd gone to Cheyenne to ask for more time, and come home instead with something else. An offer from Walter Ashford's son, Charles, for Eleanor's hand. An offer that would settle the debt, secure the ranch, and, as far as Thomas Whitfield could see, secure his daughter's future in a way that 2 years of stable visits with a hired hand never would. Thomas read the letter at the dinner table and told his daughter, without much ceremony, that Charles Ashford had asked for her, and that he'd said yes on her behalf. Eleanor didn't argue that night. She waited until she was alone with Daniel 2 days later, in the same stable where it had started, and told him the truth plainly, that she didn't love Charles Ashford, that she'd never met him more than 3 times, and that her father's ranch, and the debt that came with it, depended on this marriage in a way neither of them could undo by wanting to. It would have been easier, in a story like this one, to make Charles Ashford a villain. He wasn't. Charles was 27, soft-spoken, and about as enthusiastic about the arrangement as Eleanor was. He'd met her exactly 3 times, as she'd said, and each time had come away thinking she was kind, and sharp, and clearly in love with somebody who wasn't him, though he hadn't yet worked out who. He had his own reasons for going along with his father's arrangement. Walter Ashford was not a gentle man to disappoint, and Charles had spent 27 years learning exactly how much room there was to disagree with him, which was to say, almost none. On his second visit to the Whitfield ranch, Charles found Eleanor by the corral fence, and instead of making conversation about the wedding, he asked her, plainly, whether there was someone else. She didn't answer right away, and he told her that was answer enough, and that he wouldn't hold it against her if she needed time to reconcile herself to things. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was recognition, one person caught in a debt he hadn't chosen, watching another person caught in the same one. Charles had raised the subject with his own father once, back in Cheyenne, asking whether the marriage might be called off if the girl's heart clearly belonged elsewhere. Walter Ashford had looked at his son the way he looked at a ledger that didn't balance, and reminded him that the Whitfield note was one of the more reliable pieces of business the bank held in that county, and that a marriage tying the 2 families together was worth considerably more than whatever feelings a rancher's daughter had talked herself into. Charles hadn't argued further. He'd learned, over 27 years, exactly which arguments were worth having with his father, and this wasn't going to be one of the ones he won. Daniel didn't ask her to run. He'd thought about it, more than once, but he also understood, in a way that cost him something to admit, that asking her to choose between her father's ruin and her own happiness wasn't love. It was just a different kind of debt. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He kept working. He kept showing up. And every Tuesday, when she found a reason to come to the stable, he let himself have that hour and made peace with the fact that it might be the last one. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of June, 1889, 6 months away. The spring of 1889 was dry even by Wyoming standards. By May, the creek that fed the north pasture had thinned to a trickle, and Thomas Whitfield was up before dawn most mornings, walking fence lines that no longer had enough grass behind them to matter. The fire started on a Thursday, from a lightning strike with no rain behind it, and it moved through the dry grass of the north pasture faster than any man on horseback could outrun a warning. Daniel was the one who saw the smoke first. He was also the one who rode straight toward it, instead of away, to cut the herd loose from a corral that would have turned into a trap. It cost him a burned forearm and a horse he'd raised from a foal, and it saved 11 cattle Thomas Whitfield could not have afforded to lose that year. The other hands, Silas among them, arrived 10 minutes behind him with wet sacks and shovels, and between them, they kept the fire from the barn and the house, though the north pasture itself burned down to black stubble by the time the wind finally turned. When Thomas found Daniel afterward, blistered and soot-streaked and refusing to see the doctor before the animals were settled, he didn't say much. He didn't need to. He'd spent 30 years running a ranch and had seen plenty of hands do their job. He'd rarely seen one ride toward the fire instead of away from it without being asked. Some debts get repaid in ways no letter from a bank can measure, and Thomas Whitfield, whatever else was on his mind that season, understood that arithmetic better than most men in the county. Eleanor changed his bandages herself for the 2 weeks it took to heal, in full view of the household this time, and nobody, not her father, not the household staff, not even Silas, said a word about it out loud. Some truths get an unspoken permission to exist, right up until someone decides to say them anyway. It was during those 2 weeks that Eleanor finally read the letter her mother had left her, one she'd kept unopened in a drawer for 6 years because she hadn't been ready to hear whatever it said. Margaret Whitfield had written it in the last months of her illness, and most of it was the kind of practical advice a mother leaves a 12-year-old daughter: how to run a household, how to manage her father, who tended toward stubbornness when he was frightened rather than when he was angry. But near the end, there was a line Eleanor read a dozen times that week while Daniel's arm healed. Don't marry a debt, Eleanor. Marry a person. Your father will understand the difference eventually, even if it takes him longer than either of us would like. She didn't tell Daniel about the letter. She didn't need to. She just started acting, from that week forward, like a woman who'd already decided something and was only waiting for the world to catch up to it. Silas Grady had watched the bandage changing too, and he'd watched it the way he watched everything involving Daniel Reeves, through the lens of his own grievance. 2 days before the wedding, with nothing left to lose and a full year of resentment behind him, he went to Thomas Whitfield and told him plainly what he'd been noticing for a year and a half, that his daughter and his best ranch hand had been meeting alone for the better part of 3 years, and that whatever Thomas thought this wedding was going to fix, it wasn't going to fix that. Thomas Whitfield did not react the way Silas expected. He didn't rage. He didn't fire Daniel on the spot, though Silas had clearly hoped he would. He simply asked one question: does she love him? Silas, who had built his entire case on scandal rather than substance, didn't have an answer to that. Thomas dismissed him and rode out to find his daughter himself. He found her in the stable, where else, and asked her the same question he'd asked Silas. This time, he got an answer. Yes, Eleanor said. For 3 years. And I was going to marry Charles Ashford anyway, because I thought that was the only way to save this ranch and never make you choose between me and it. I wasn't going to make you choose. I was choosing for you. Thomas Whitfield stood in the stable doorway for a long moment, working through something that looked less like anger and more like grief for time he hadn't realized he'd lost. I never asked you to save the ranch by ruining your own life, he said finally. I asked the bank for time. You gave me a wedding instead. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't permission, either. It was 2 days before the wedding, and neither of them knew, walking out of that stable, what was going to happen next. The Whitfield barn had been cleared out and decorated with white ribbon and wildflowers for the ceremony, because Eleanor had asked for it to be held there instead of the church in town, and her father, in a rare concession, made before Silas's visit had changed everything he thought he knew, had allowed it. Daniel wasn't invited. He came anyway, and stood at the back, near the door, where he could leave quickly if he needed to. Charles Ashford stood at the front in a suit that cost more than Daniel made in a year, and if he noticed the tension in the room, he didn't show it, though later, people would say he'd looked more relieved than surprised by how the morning ended, which tells you something about how willingly he'd walked into this arrangement in the first place. Eleanor was 2 lines into her vows when she stopped. She turned, not to Charles, but toward the back of the barn, toward the door, where she'd somehow known, without looking, that Daniel would be standing. "I can't," she said, loud enough for 40 guests to hear. "I told someone once that I believed him. I still do. And I won't stand here and promise the rest of my life to a man I've met 3 times, when there's one I've known for 3 years who never once asked me to lie about how I felt, even when lying would have been easier for both of us." Thomas Whitfield rose from his seat, and for a moment the entire barn went still enough to hear the horses shifting in the stalls outside. "Eleanor," he started. "You raised me to keep my word," she said. "I'm keeping it, just not the one you wanted." Charles Ashford, to his credit, was the first person in the barn to move. He stepped back from the altar, straightened his jacket, and said, quietly enough that only the front row heard it, that he'd been waiting 3 years for someone to finally say what everyone already knew. Daniel didn't say anything grand. He didn't need to. He crossed the barn, took her hand in front of everyone who'd come to watch her marry someone else, and said the only thing that felt true. "I never asked you to choose me. I just never stopped hoping you would." Thomas Whitfield didn't speak to his daughter for the better part of 2 months. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, though it felt that way to Eleanor at the time. It was a proud man working through the gap between the life he'd planned for his daughter and the one she'd chosen instead, and doing it slowly, the way he did most things that mattered. Eleanor kept working the ranch alongside Daniel through that stretch, and kept leaving a plate at her father's usual place at supper whether he acknowledged her or not, and eventually, sometime in that second month, he started eating it before it went cold, which she took, correctly, as the beginning of an answer. Walter Ashford withdrew the bank's note on the ranch out of pride, and for one hard winter, it looked like Eleanor's choice might cost her father everything he'd built, the very outcome she'd spent 3 years trying to prevent. It didn't, in the end. Daniel had spent 4 years learning every acre of that land better than anyone else who could have inherited it, and by spring, Thomas Whitfield admitted, first to himself, and eventually out loud, that the man his daughter had chosen was already doing the job he'd have hired anyone else to do, and had been doing it, without complaint, since before there was any reason to hope it would matter. Silas Grady left the Whitfield ranch that spring for a position at a neighboring outfit, and nobody was sorry to see him go. Charles Ashford, for his part, married a banker's daughter from Denver 2 years later, by all accounts happily, the kind of ending nobody expects for the other man, in a story like this one, and exactly the kind he deserved, since he'd never been the villain to begin with. Daniel and Eleanor were married the following June, in the same barn, with considerably fewer white ribbons and considerably more people who actually meant it when they wished her well. Thomas Whitfield walked his daughter down the aisle himself, and if anyone in the county still remembered the scandal of the wedding that never finished, nobody brought it up that day. 10 years later, the Whitfield Ranch was known throughout the territory as one of the best-run outfits in Wyoming, and most people who mentioned it in passing had stopped calling it the Whitfield Ranch at all. It was Reeves' land now, in everything but the name on the original deed, which Thomas insisted stay exactly as it was until the day he died, 7 years into his daughter's marriage. With both his grandchildren and the memory of a wedding day scandal long since folded into the kind of story a family tells fondly at supper rather than in whispers. Eleanor kept her mother's letter in the same drawer for the rest of her life. She never needed to read it again after that spring. She'd already done what it asked. If you're enjoying this journey through the American frontier, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps this channel continue bringing you heartfelt stories filled with courage, family, sacrifice, love, and unforgettable twists. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until our next story, remember that the greatest treasures are often hidden where the world forgets to look.